We are starting chapters 9 and 10, and we're going to do these chapters together as we'll do many chapters together over the next few weeks so we could speed things up to get to the Civil War. So, chapters 9 and 10, we're going to talk about post Constitution America, and we're going to start off with April 30th, 1789, is the inauguration day, the day that George Washington officially becomes president of the United States. Inauguration Day is now done in January 20th, but the first one was done in April in 1789. So George Washington is our president, and he set a precedent as president. And precedent means, let's say that there is someone in your class that just drives me nuts. And I've had enough of that person. And finally, after a while, I just walk up and smack the crap out of them, smack them as hard as I can. And they go flying to the floor. Well, in reality, I'd obviously be fired. But let's say I don't get fired. Let's say that Mr. Beals and Mr. Quick talk about this and they know how annoying that one particular student in your class is. So they just suspend me for a month. Well, next year you go to eighth grade, and Mr. Gallion has that same student. And after a while, he just has enough of him and he just smacks the crap out of him. Well, they're trying to figure out what his punishment's going to be, and they decide that it needs to be the same as mine because it's the same crime as mine. So they are going to set a precedent by with mine and give it to Mr. Guy, and so he's going to be suspended a month. When you get to high school, a teacher there gets tired of him, smacks him, he gets a month suspension. So a precedent just kind of sets the rules for others to follow, but it doesn't necessarily have to be written down. So George Washington served just 2 terms, and that was a precedent. It wasn't written down. It was not in the Constitution anywhere, but that's just the way that people did it for many, many years. So a definition of a precedent is an act or a decision that sets an example for others to follow. And everyone followed this. George Washington thought no one needed to be president more than 8 years. So everyone did the same thing until the 1940s when Franklin Roosevelt was elected 4 times and he eventually died in office. After Franklin Roosevelt, there was an amendment made to the Constitution, and we talked about that process last chapter. But this amendment said that the president could only serve 2 terms maximum. They also set up the first cabinet in 1789. And, we learned in the Constitution that the cabinet is the heads of different departments. And the Secretary of State, this is kind of the big cabinet position. And this is the person that deals with other countries, does a lot of things with other countries. And Thomas Jefferson was named the first Secretary of State. Along with that, another important cabinet position is Secretary of Treasury. They're the ones that are in charge of our whole money system. And Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of Treasury. And Hamilton and Jefferson did not get along at all. Also in 1789, the Judiciary Act was passed. This set up our court system throughout the nation. It showed how we would have the different levels of courts. Not everything is the Supreme Court. It has to start at the local and move up. So the Judiciary Act set all that up. Now, there was a big disagreement going on at this time about whether or not the government should pick up the state's debts. The war was over, and the country owed a lot of money. But since we were not united before the war, they're trying to say, should the states pick up their own debts and pay it back, or should the country as a whole? Well, our Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton came up with a plan to do this. The South had a lot of money, though. They did not need any help paying back the debt. The North did. Hamilton is from the North. He's from New York. But if you think about the South having money, they have all these plantations and all this land. But how do they get that money? By farming the land. And who really farmed the land? The slaves farmed the land. So the South had money because of the slave labor, and the North was struggling financially. The North needed help paying off their debts. So eventually a compromise was made. And in this compromise, Congress voted to make the District of Columbia the nation's capital. Now, at this time, there was no DC. It was nothing. There was nothing there, and they decided, hey, let's move the capital from New York, where it started, to Washington, D.C., or yeah, to D.C., because it's going to be closer to the South. So they made Washington, D.C. to be the capital city. It was made for that very reason. It wasn't a city before that. So they took about 10 years to get Washington, D.C. made, and it's called District of Columbia, then obviously Washington after George Washington. They did this because the southern states wanted the capital closer to New York. I just said all that. So in order to do this, Congress had to vote to repay the debts for all states. Okay, so the deal was we moved the capital from New York to Washington, D.C., and in return, you're going to pay off all of the state's debts. The nation's capital will, and they'll use the country will as a whole. And they're going to use money from all of the states. So by 1800, it was given the name Washington, D.C., and it was ready to use. But in the meantime, while we had that 10-year period, they had Philadelphia as the capital city because it was located more closely to the South. And they were happy with that just to get it out of New York because they had a long way to travel. They didn't have airplanes or trains or that kind of thing. So they had a longer way to travel. They didn't want to travel that far to go to our capital for their meetings and stuff. So Philadelphia became a compromise. Washington, D.C. was the ultimate compromise. But in order to do this, they had to agree that the country would pay for all the state's debts. So basically, a lot of the South's money was going to go help pay off the northern debts, and in return, they get the capital closer to home. Okay, but Hamilton's argument was, we're one country now. Let's start off with money instead of being broke. Um, Thomas Jefferson eventually said that was the biggest mistake he ever made. And my Hamilton fans, the song "The Room Where It Happens" is about that very agreement. So, all right, that's all the notes for this lesson.